Well, good evening. We want to welcome everyone to joining our Uniting for Kids webinar. Tonight we're talking about opting out of high stakes testing. The most common test around the country is the PARCC test, and there are several different versions. Here in Colorado, we have legislation that's looking at replacing the PARCC test in the 9th grade and 10th grade with the SATs. But tests still are part of the ESSA and the Every Child Succeeds Act. So even though Congress reauthorized the No Child Left Behind Act to push that towards states, the requirement is still that every child be tested in every grade. And as parents, we have the right to opt out of those standardized testing. And many parents throughout the country have different reasons for opting out. The reasons vary. Some kids have extreme test anxiety. Other kids, who are taking those tests where English isn't their primary language, or they have a special need or some kind of learning ability. Those tests never accurately reflect their skills, and so they opt out for that reason. Some of us, including me, I have two daughters. They are 19 and 17 years old, and we have always opted out of statewide standardized tests. I've got a daughter who's now in college as a freshman and opting out of the tests, despite all of the myths and all of the threats, didn't prohibit her at all from attending college. They didn't even look at those standardized tests. They're not interested in them. And in terms of her preparation, she's been very well prepared for college. So I know parents opt out for various reasons, and I just want to speak kind of generally about parents who are wanting to exercise their rights to opt out across the country. In the very beginning, when we initiated the opt-out movement, it was because there was a recognition that we would be narrowing the curriculum, and this idea of a standardization and every child learning the exact same thing at the exact same time wasn't in the interest of kids. It didn't cultivate creativity, it didn't cultivate collaboration, and it certainly didn't address the most important challenge to education, which is the opportunity gap. And what we've seen since the passage of No Child Left Behind and the adoption of test-based accountability is a widening of the achievement gap and not a narrowing of the achievement gap. And more children today have been left behind than ever before. We know that kids are going on to college and they are lacking those necessary skills to succeed in the rigors of college because their curriculum has been so narrowed, because they have been learning in terms of Bloom's taxonomy, kind of the lower levels of thinking in the order. So we have really, in terms of the opt-out movement, we've been at this a long time, for more than 15 years now, ever since No Child Left Behind was enacted in 2002. And we always have been able to opt out as parents, regardless of what state, what district you live in. The right to opt out is a protected right, and it's protected by the United States Supreme Court, which within our Constitution has upheld the right of parents to direct their child's education. And so even though rules around opting out vary by states and different legislation governs that, parents, regardless of where you are, regardless of whether your children are in elementary school or whether they're in high school, all parents have the right to opt their children out. And I'll just give three kind of basic guidelines for opting out. First of all, if it's in your child's interest to opt out of the test, then opt them out. It doesn't matter what that reason is. If it's creating stress and anxiety, opt them out. If you feel like it creates a system of inequity and it punishes, children of low-income means, and you don't want to reinforce those injustices, opt your children out. Whatever reason you have, you are supported in that decision by the Supreme Court. We have a parent's guide on Uniting for Kids and it gives you a sample letter that you can use, and also the specific Supreme Court rulings that support that. But there's not a single case in the past 15 years that has prevented parents from opting out. The only exception are charter schools who write it in their contract that parents can only attend that charter school if they agree to take the test. Those are the only obstacles that we've found. And for those parents that do attend those charter schools, I always encourage them just to cross that out and to put a signature that their child will still be taking the test. Whether or not that school excludes them, that is going to vary by charter school. But regardless of where you are, you have the right to opt out. One of the things that you can expect in opting out is some resistance. And administrators all handle this differently. Some are very cooperative. We've found that a lot more and more districts are posting the process for opting out on their district websites. So if you go there and check that out, otherwise a simple, phone call to the district to find out if there is a process. If there's not a process, a letter saying that you opt your child out of the test is adequate, and expect resistance a lot of the time. And so, if you can go into this expecting that there's going to be a little bit of pushback and a little bit of challenge, you can prepare yourself and simply, how you're going to address that. Some parents are invited to the school for a meeting with the principal. You can simply decline that. You can simply state, as parents having this right, we're firm in this decision. If you do get pushback, what I always suggest is creating a paper trail and making sure that there's adequate documentation. So if, for example, a teacher says, oh, no, you don't have the right to opt out, you're simply going to reply with, please show me where it is in your district policy that you are denying parents their rights to opt out of state testing. So the third thing that you want to be ready for and address is that schools really are strapped, and this is part of the problem that that's been created as a result of high stakes testing, is it's redirected critical resources away from the classroom and towards those test publishers. So the challenge is that if students opt out, that schools and teachers don't have the resources and the mechanism for how to provide alternative opportunities or alternative assignments. So I always say to parents, please take it upon yourself to assume the responsibility for the alternatives that are going to be provided. One thing that we did was we kept our children in school, but they went to the library during testing time. And in the library, they had a novel. They had some writing pieces that they were working on. They might have some math assignments that certainly reflect kind of more authentic kinds of learning. You can find those are available on the internet. But, really, even if you have your child develop a budget, talk about a long-term financial plan, things that are real world and are things that are ultimately going to benefit them in real life are certainly the kind of alternatives that we want to provide for our children to all standardized testing. So the last question that comes up a lot is, what is the definition of high stakes standardized testing? And the aspect of this is standardized is every child is taking that exact same measurement, then it's standardized. If there's high stakes associated with that, meaning if a school is graded on that test, or a teacher is graded on that test, or even a student is denied, placement in various AP or advanced classes as a result of that single measurement tool, that makes it a high stakes measure. That makes it a high stakes test. So you can opt out of all high stakes tests, but you can opt out of other digital learning as well. We know, and we're going to talk about this in our next meeting, that with digital learning that there are a lot of privacy issues. And so as a parent, you can exercise your right to opt out in all different ways. And again, it comes back to what's in the best interest of your child. We have examples before high stakes testing of parents that would opt out of various texts because they had religious or political differences regarding those pieces of literature. So regardless of what it is, you have the right to opt out of curriculum that you feel is damaging to either your child or to the teacher or to the school, as we've seen with this high stakes test accountability. So again, please check out our website at unitingforkids.com. We have resources around protecting your child's privacy. We have resources around opting out, even around how to choose school board candidates. So please check us out at Uniting for Kids. And I'm going to turn it over to some other parents that are going to talk about their individual opt-out stories. They vary. And Jenny Lynn Coley, if you don't mind kind of introducing yourself briefly and sharing a little bit about your opt-out experience, we'd appreciate it.
Absolutely. My name is Jenny Lynn Coley, and I am the mother of 3 children, 2 of which are still in school, and I have chosen to opt them out of not only statewide standardized testing, but even the district and school level assessments that aren't directly tied to their grade performance, for a number of reasons. And when I initially decided to opt them out, I went ahead and wrote a letter, and the letter, I got a little bit of pushback on the letter, especially because they had just changed the policy to where everything needed to be done online. However, in our particular school district, that online process only covered the actual statewide testing. And so I, advocated on behalf of my son, because he was the one that's most affected by it, my 13-year-old. His name is Jalen. This is my, at the time, younger child. He's 7. His name's Jonah. And so he's in 2nd grade now and wouldn't have been taking those statewide tests yet at that point. And so then I received a phone call back that they had an exception from the district, that they were going to go ahead and accept my letter to allow him to be opted out of all of those testing. So I definitely agree with what Angela was saying earlier about sometimes you'll get pushback, but you have rights, and definitely please advocate on behalf of your children for whatever you are behind opting them out of testing. I have a couple of different reasons why I've chosen to opt my children out. One of them being just, the things that are on the questions that are on those tests are not directly tied to their curriculum and to their actual learning. And so I feel like it is a lot of wasted instructional time for teachers to be teaching to these tests. That's really taking away from the true value of their learning. They're not only with the curriculum itself, but all of those other life skills, social emotional skills, preparing them to be productive and well-balanced members of society. Mm-hmm. Our education system's job is not just to produce a workforce, but really to produce meaningful, productive members of society. The other major reason why I've chosen to opt them out is really because from the very beginning, these standardized tests have been set up as a tracking and measurement tool in a way to really kind of segregate kids. And it actually reinforces and condemns children of color, children of low socioeconomic backgrounds, English language learners, children with disabilities. And I don't believe in contributing to furthering the widening of, the opportunity gap, really, because it's not an achievement gap. It's really more of an opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you, Jenny Lynn. Zach, I'll open it up for some questions from the whole group after this. Zach, you're a student, and I know that you've been involved. In fact, you were even featured in the magazine 5280 about your leadership with opting out and organizing students at your school. So tell us a little bit about your experience as a student.
So I go to South High School, and for my sophomore and junior years, I actually led the opt-out movement among students at South. Mm-hmm. And both years we saw some really good success. Last year we actually had 70% of juniors opt out and
Wow.
around 40% of sophomores opting out of the test, which was like a huge improvement from before because no kids had opted out. And the way I did it was all just on the ground. I didn't use social media. I printed out pamphlets and flyers that had information on how kids could opt out, and it had a sheet where basically all you had to do was put your kid's name and sign, and you could give it to the school and it would let you opt out much more easily. So I made the process a lot easier for families in the area. And so I'd bring these pamphlets every day. Everyone knew that I had them, and kids, would come to me throughout the day asking for them. I'd pass them out to anyone who had questions. You have to know a little bit about the movement to lead it and be able to, tell kids why this is good, how this is not going to hurt their school, stuff like that. And so I would answer questions for kids, explain to them how it's helping the schools. And I mean, soon enough, like the actual administration of the school had found out about what I was doing. And that really, well, the reason this was so like important is because I heard stories about the administration confiscating these forms from students. Students would have their parents call into the office, and people who, administrators would completely lie to parents, telling them that opting out isn't even an option for students, which was shocking to me. But a lot of parents don't know better, so that they ended up not being able to opt their kids out. So it was insane, the pushback that we actually received from the school, and I was very surprised. But I responded to it by continuing to pass out opt-out notes, even though I had deans looking for me. No one knew who the opt-out kid was. It was me.
Now they do. But you weren't deterred.
I was not deterred, and I think sometimes you have to stand up in the face of fear and do what's right. What I was doing is completely legal. I was abiding the law, and what the school was doing was not only legally wrong, but immoral. There's definitely a conflict of interest. And so, my movement ended up turning out pretty well. We'll see how it goes this year, but it was quite the interesting experience seeing how negatively the school reacted to it.
Yeah, and I understand you're adding Instagram to your strategy this year.
I am. I think that's the plan. Might as well. Social outreach is a good way to do it, and when you have a lot of kids your age following you, it's a good way to communicate with younger folk.
And what motivated you, Zach, to opt out? I mean, why did you think it was so important, not only for you to opt out, but to educate other students to opt out?
I feel that schools in general are being very adversely affected by the high-stakes standardized testing movement. I feel that teachers are being unfairly treated because of the high-stakes standardized testing movement, and I feel that it is not nearly the best way that you could look at a school and analyze how well a school is doing compared to schools like in a state or nationwide. I don't think it's the way to go, and I could not stand with it, and it was a moral wrong to me.
Did you, in your own education, did you see as you got older more and more of an emphasis on those tests? And
I did. What I really hated and what sucked was that a lot of times in classes which I thought would end up, would be interesting classes, the teachers would be forced not to teach the actual curriculum of the class, but to teach us as students how to take the test at the end of the year. So they weren't teaching us, the real material. They were teaching us how to take a test. And that really sucked to me.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us and not only exercising your rights as a student, but really helping other students to understand that they had a right and they had a choice. You know, a lot of times, you know, we hear in the reform movement, you know, we want choices, we want choices. And I think, you know, you exercising that right to opt out of tests really demonstrates your adherence to giving students choices and choices beyond standardized testing, but a really a call out and a demand for a richer, more meaningful curriculum that goes behind, you know, simply labeling schools and teachers, because you deserve that. I mean, that's the whole goal of, you know, education. And
Mm-hmm.
I just really applaud you and your efforts for um, you know, I mean, leadership is tough, and so, you know, thank you for paving the way for other students to be able to be
Absolutely.
part of this movement,
It's
exercise
important.
choices. Yeah, I think it's, for a lot of people, ends up being very empowering, even though it may begin as, you know, kind of frightening. So you're a wonderful example of that, and I understand that you're actually an aide at the legislature. So
I am, yeah.
sounds like this has really kind of launched your public service um, future, and that you'll be a real credit to the country. So thank you, Zach.
I hope so. Thanks a lot.
Anything else that you want to add before we move to our next guest?
I think I've said what I need to say.
Okay. All right. Well, next person I'm going to go to is Susan Johnson. You have a very interesting opt-out story, because not only did you get some serious pushback, but you probably have the best story of pushing right back. So.
Oh my gosh. Well, it's a case of me acting tough, but inside not feeling so tough. But I decided and 3 years ago that I was going to opt my kids out of standardized testing for a lot of the same reasons Jenny Lynn mentioned and Zach mentioned as well. I felt like there was too much emphasis being put on the test, too much class time prepping for the test, too much badly needed funding and resources going to the test. And I attended an opt-out meeting and learned more about it, learned how to write an opt-out letter, and I also was expecting some pushback, but had no idea of how much pushback I would actually get. So at the time I had my daughter in middle school and my son was in high school. And I wrote letters and turned them into the office the day before the testing for both students. My son's high school just gave me a phone call and wanted to verify with me that I was indeed opting him out and that he didn't write the opt-out letter. And I said yes, and they said okay, and told me what day he should report back to school. My daughter was the polar opposite. My phone started blowing up at work as soon as the principal got the letter, and he started threatening us. And the first threat was that she would not be able to attend school for an entire month. So that was to cover 2 weeks of testing and then 2 weeks of makeup dates. And so maybe even though they might not have testing in the afternoons or on a Friday, he informed me that she wouldn't be able to attend school. So when I added it up, it was a full month of school that she would miss. And I told him that was not the case and that there was Supreme Court precedent for parents to have direction in their children's education, and that I would be bringing her into school as soon as the tests were finished in the morning, and that we would be coming into the office to check her in. So I brought her into school. After the tests were finished, he called me into the office and he told me that that was not the case and that if we left her there at school, he was going to test her. I asked my daughter what class she should be in at the moment, and she told me, and I said, I would like you to take your backpack and report to your teacher and report to your class. And I told the principal that I better not hear that she had been pulled out of her class or there was going to be a price to pay for him. So
You threatened him right back.
I did. I acted tough. I was not feeling tough, but I acted tough. So he then called a security guard to have us walked out of the building. I had a friend with me who was recording things on a phone. And the security guard walked us out of the building, but we kept our toes in the door because we didn't want to get locked out of the building. And so we waited for about 5 minutes, and we went back into the office and found out that my daughter had indeed been pulled out of her classroom and brought into her room for some testing.
Wow.
So, and this was the secretaries in the office who knew me because I was the PTA treasurer, and they were watching things on the monitors. So I went into the room where they were preparing her to take the test. There was somebody from the district there, a test specialist who was there, who quoted state law to me when I went in. And I told my daughter to pick up her backpack and told them we would be back the next day, and left the school and emailed the principal and told them that if he didn't back off, we were calling the media, our attorney, and our state legislators, and the police. And that, and this was advice I got from United Opt-out. I was calling everybody I could think of, and I did call the police, by the way. And so I made a lot of phone calls, and the next day I reported back to school once the testing was completed, and was met there by a reporter. We did a quick interview. The reporter walked with me up to the school, and we were met at the doors of the school by 2 armed district security guards.
Wow.
With loaded guns
Oh my
on
God.
their waists. Yes.
Jeez.
They told us that the media wasn't allowed into the building, but that they would walk me in, and they were there for the protection of the principal and for me. So they walked us in. We sat in the office for about 45 minutes, and we saw lots of district officials in and out talking to the principal. And they finally called us in, and the principal's supervisor was sitting in the office, and she told us that they had left the decision up to the principal. And he looked at us and said, well, after some deep thought, I've decided that I'll let your daughter come to classes during non-testing periods. And so that was the end of that story, but it is what sort of propelled me into helping other parents opt out. And there's been, just in helping other parents opt out, there's been many different forms of pushback from the schools. But
and it did make the news, right, Susan? Because I think that's how we initially got connected, was that I saw your news story.
It did. It got picked up by a couple of local television stations. It was in the paper. It got picked up and tweeted by Diane Ravitch. And so it sort of made the rounds.
Yeah, terrific. That's pretty extreme in terms of, that's the most extreme story of pushback I've ever heard. Usually they kind of make some idle threats, and parents say, please put it in writing. And then they end up, just kind of giving up. But to be met at the door with, 2 armed security guards, that you were brave.
It was a scary thing. But the good thing is after that happened, the district sent out a district-wide policy telling principals that if they had parents opting out, that they needed to back off and let the parents opt out.
Okay. Wow. So it had large impact across your entire district.
It did.
Yeah.
It
fantastic.
did. It did. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other principals who, it seems to be a school by school thing in our district. So some schools are easy, some aren't. But I've still, even last year, I've heard stories of principals pushing back, intimidating students and parents, and pressuring them. So.
Teresa, please share your story. I had a moment of lapse there because I wanted to pull up what the bill in Colorado that allowed for parents to opt out. I think it's 1141, but let me see if I can find that while you're talking.
Okay. My name is Teresa Smith, and I have two high schoolers. They are 9th and 10th graders this year. And I first decided to opt out when my current freshman was a 6th grader in elementary school. He was a average to high average student. He was on an advanced learning plan for language arts. We had just had parent-teacher conferences, and there were no concerns about his learning, his performance at all. And then the next week, so this was in the fall for the fall conferences, I got notified that his TCAP scores, his growth score was not high enough for somebody, whoever was putting together this list, and that they wanted him to skip his elective classes in order to attend or to complete remedial reading on the computer using a Reading Plus program. And I was outraged, first of all, because the teachers hadn't said anything, and this was very much a surprise to me. And my son was upset about it. He'd never been a poor reader, but according to whatever score, the growth score, he was deemed to be not good enough. And so I decided if he was going to be reduced to a score, then nobody was going to get his scores anymore. And I didn't really know what I was doing with that. And so that was October. In January, I went to an opt-out meeting, I believe, with Angela, and have been involved in the opt-out movement ever since. Luckily for me, I didn't have the same experience as Susan. I just submitted my letters. They were kind of questioned. They said, well, you need to fill out this other form. I said, no, thank you. And they're like, okay. And so it just wasn't a big deal. We didn't have any pushback at all. What was striking to me, though, or what was really upsetting, I was working in the school at the time, and I could see how much time and effort and resources were spent on testing, and that teachers were having to spend so much of their time testing when they could have been teaching actual subjects. They were put in a really bad position of being forced to do this, but knowing that it wasn't best practices, it was kind of a waste of time, but they had to do it. And so I felt bad for the teachers. They seemed kind of apologetic that my son was having to be put on the remedial program, which we declined. And it also, because I knew the teachers, I privately got kind of cheered on by them. So I knew that this was something that, yes, teachers are supposed to say, no, you can't opt out. But in the background, they were cheering me on and saying, you know what, please, thank you. Thank you for fighting for us, and please keep it up. But really what was probably most upsetting to me was thinking about if my kid, who's a high average kid on an advanced learning plan, was being punished for this. What about the kids that didn't even, speak English as their first language? And it made me think of my mother, who was a first-generation Mexican-American and did not speak English when she entered elementary school. So if she had been in school the way the schools are today, I don't believe that she would have been encouraged to get like a full education the way that certain kids have access to. And I don't think that she would have gone on to graduate from high school and get a nursing degree and get a master's degree and be a standout professional in her field. And so it really just made me concerned for all the people that have even more challenges than my son, who I didn't really think was challenged at all. So I felt like the number of people being punished by tests is so great. And that's when I decided that it wasn't going to be for me. And it wasn't going to be for any kids if I could help it.
Thank you. And it is interesting how like there's pushback some places and there's no pushback other places. And really what we've seen across the country is more parents exercise their right, that there is less and less pushback. And I think, you know, we saw with the Every Child Succeeds, essentially what the federal government said is, gosh, we've made a mess here with this No Child Left Behind and federal control of, you know, managing schools based on these test scores. And so what we're going to do, hi Sylvia, I was just getting ready to text you, so thank you for joining us. What we saw as a result of the Every Child Succeeds Act is, you know, someone is our Congress and representatives who said, we have a mess here. And since we don't know how to clean it up, we're just going to direct that back to the states to try and make sense out of this. And there isn't any way to make sense because it's a policy of grading schools based on test scores when the number one correlating factors to test scores is socioeconomic status. Essentially what you're doing is punishing schools that have low-income children, and you're inflating the ratings of high-income schools. So the system is broken, and there isn't any way for states to be able to fix this. The only real way to remove test-based accountability and to return to a more student-centered, holistic, collaborative approach to education is for parents across the country to opt out en masse. And we're seeing that, and it's having an effect. So Sylvia, we just have made the rounds in terms of everyone sharing their opt-out story. You're unique in that you have, you know, a very little one and older children. And so you've really kind of seen the impact that the reform has had from the very beginning now to your young son. Is he in first grade?
He's now in second.
Second grade. Okay. Well, if you don't mind just kind of sharing your opt-out story. We've got people, you know, obviously all over the country who come from different districts. I know you're in a different district. So if you don't mind just kind of sharing your story, we'd appreciate hearing from you.
Sure, no problem. So I'm in Will District 6 in Greeley, Colorado. And my whole experience, I've actually paying attention to the whole high stakes situation. I was meeting with Don Pearl back in, I believe it was 2003. At the time, my oldest was in elementary school. And so I started learning a little bit about it, but I didn't know a whole lot until the way it impacted my family the most was when my son, my oldest, who's now 22, went to 6th grade middle school. And at that time, he's coming home with remedial math, what it seemed like to me, addition, subtraction, small numbers, and multiplication. And so I went to the counselor, asked why he's doing this, and she told me he was placed there based on his scores. She pulled out his, at that time I'm not sure, it was CSAP, I believe.
Yes, CSAP, the beginning.
Oh, goodness. And so I asked for him to be moved, and why was she only looking at the scores? Because that's all she pulled from a student file when I was talking to her, is the scores from the testing. And she said that's what she had to do, is base it on what he scored on the testing. Well, I refused to allow that to happen. And she said, well, I don't know him well enough to move him up a grade. She talked to the teacher at the time, his math teacher at the time, and they weren't sure whether they should place him out of remedial math. Again, I was never told that, right, that he was in remedial math. They just placed him, and I just found out based on the homework he was bringing home. And so they said they didn't know if he would do well enough to move him up. And I said, well, you don't know him well enough to leave him where he's at. So they said, well, we'll move him, after me going in a couple of times, sitting there and demanding to speak to the counselor again because she didn't move him initially. And they told me she's in a meeting. I said, I'll sit here all day if I have to. I will not take no for an answer. I'm talking to her. She then talked to the teacher. They talked to the assistant principal. I had to get a paper signed by the assistant principal approving the move. They moved him. And I told her because he based this only on his math test scores and nothing else, he will no longer be taking the test. I did that because I knew how strong he was in math. And granted, he didn't test well. He didn't do well in math, and the standardized testing. My son ended up graduating 4 years ago with Math Magnet STEM endorsement. He was one of about, I would say 20 kids of his entire class graduating with that. And so by the time he ended up in 9th grade, again, I had to go through this process every year, 6th, 7th, and then I had principals telling me, you can't do that, you're gonna hurt the schools, and well, thanks, I met you quite a while back as well, through Don Pearl. And I knew to stand my ground. I knew that if I had all my facts, that I wasn't gonna be bullied or scared into my kids taking a test that was the wherewithal of where they would be placed. And so again, 6th, 7th, and 8th, I had to go through a lot of hurdles, had to talk to several principals. And when my son started 9th grade, he actually went to 9th grade, started Algebra 2, and he'd already done geometry. He took pre-cal as a freshman. So he was doing really good, and he's still doing really good. Based on that horrible experience, he was actually, unfortunately, he had some negative experiences with the teachers as well. Not a lot, but at the time there was a lot more teachers who were against kids opting out, who were actually pretty vocal with my son in their classroom, telling him, well, if you don't test, then what are you doing in this school? You should move to a different school because you're going to affect us. That kind of stuff. Yeah. We went through a lot, but we stood our ground, and my daughter is now a junior, the middle child. She's 16, and she does not take the test. Then I have the 2nd grader, and I've already informed his teacher he will not be taking the test this year.
Yeah, and I good for you for standing up, because I think about, gosh, what would your son's life look like right now if you would have just accepted those test scores as the directive for where he should be placed and what his abilities were?
Yes, he went from being, in remedial math all the way through graduating with STEM.
Yeah, that's terrific. Well, congratulations to you. I think a lot of parents, the argument for high stakes testing has been, really that if we need those tests to know how our students are doing. And your example, and Teresa, your example of those were incorrect, examples of what our children could do. The information was not accurate. And so recognizing that those are not accurate indicators, and really trusting ourselves as parents, looking at their homework, looking at their past records of performance and the other classroom indicators, and being able to say, no, I have enough information to know how my child is doing. I don't need, Park Tests or Pearson and their, bubbles to tell me about my kid. We're in communication, we're looking over the work, we're having those conversations, so we know. So I think you two really illustrate that example. I have one other question that I just want to end with, and I want to be cognizant of time, so we're coming up on the 45-minute mark. And that's that the reform movement, a lot of those that have been behind this, the Gates Foundation, and here in Colorado we have organizations like A+. Nationally, it's been Stand for Children, but you have really big money, very wealthy philanthropists that have engaged in the policy process around education. And their argument has been, they have made it a civil rights imperative that we have to have school accountability based on these tests, because children of color and minority children have not gotten the education that they need. What's your response to that? What would you guys say about that argument?
I'll go first, if that's okay.
Sure.
I would quickly say that all we have to do is look at data. So if what the result, the all end result of this is to look at data and see how well kids are doing, how much kids are doing, and holding schools accountable. This is Enrique. Say hi, Enrique. Then let's look at, yeah. So then I would say, let's look at that. Let's look at the data. Let's look back 10 years. Let's look back 10, 12, 14 years.
Mhm.
Tell me how children of color have done through this testing regime. How have they done? What are the graduation rates? What are the classes, remedial classes, kids even moving on to college, let alone making it through high school? So let's look at that data. If we're saying let's emphasize accountability, that's what we've been doing for the past
15 years.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And where are we? I mean, I was just looking at some information. The Department of Education federally didn't come about until the 1980s. And where are we based on that coming to fruition? Nothing. Nowhere better.
Yeah,
Nobody can tell me we're going to be better off.
Yeah, that's a great argument. And here in Colorado, what we've seen since, I mean, we had an earlier version of No Child Left Behind that hit in 2000 with Senate Bill 186, Senate Bill 186. And that was the first bill that was using CSAP tests to grade schools. What we know in terms of the achievement gap is that it has doubled in terms of the number of at-risk children. What we know in terms of those kids, you know, being prepared for college is, according to the Colorado Commission on Higher Education, is that kids are requiring much more remediation than they were 15 years ago. And the largest jump, it jumped 11 percentage points. And that jump happened with the first No Child Left Behind class that graduated from high school. 11 percentage points jump. So I think you're exactly right in that we say, let's take a look at, you know, what has been the outcome. The Department of Education did a report, and they found that the achievement gap across the nation was flat. I have to tell you that I'm a little skeptical of that, because I don't think that you have the achievement gap widen in Colorado, but nationally it remains flat. And still, even if you did buy their argument that achievement has remained flat, you have to ask the question that you did, Sylvia, is that we've spent billions and billions of dollars on this as a solution to addressing school accountability. And it's quite frankly, you know,
lunacy. It's lunacy.
Yeah, it is lunacy. Yeah.
And I think,
go ahead.
And I think one other thing to note is that the standardized tests that are administered at the state, from the state levels, have been shown to represent nothing more than socioeconomic level over everything else. There's a general trend that's really showing that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I agree.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is hurting, in turn, the inner city schools, because the ratings of these schools are then declined, and these schools are shut down and replaced with charter schools.
Yes, what we have is the legitimization for privatization. If you have a mechanism that labels public education as failing, then what you create is, you know, the opportunity for the dismantling of public education and the move towards privatization. So, you know, what we're seeing with the recent confirmation of Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education, and this move towards privatization and vouchers, charterization, all of that, that's all part of the design in terms of the reform movement. And when you talk to the original voucher proponents, as I've sat down with them and have one-on-one conversations, and what they say is, you know, we needed a mechanism to demonstrate that schools were failing. Well, we didn't have failing schools. What we had was a failing system of equity in education, and high stakes testing has not addressed that. So I just want to, Zach, you brought up a really important point, which is a lot of times parents will say, well, I can't opt out because it hurts the schools. And what I think we all have to come to terms with, and it's challenging, is that high stakes testing is what hurts the schools. And to continue to conform to that and comply with that furthers that injustice. And what
Absolutely.
Yeah, and what we're seeing as a national trend is you've seen that argument. Well, I don't want to opt out because it hurts my school. And eventually, because of the way that No Child Left Behind was written, it's a mathematical impossibility. It was by design that every school would fail. It was every school had to increase by 1 percentage point every year. And if they didn't conform to that level of growth, then their ratings would continue to decline. So if you look at that, it's an absolute a mathematical possibility. It was never designed to be an accurate model, and it was never designed to either improve schools or to support student learning. And those parents who haven't quite made that connection and continue to be complicit in this model of evaluating schools based on tests really do more damage than those parents who say this is a game that's rigged and our teachers can't win, our schools can't win, but most importantly, our own children can't win if we continue to comply with this. So that's what I would say to those parents who say, well, I don't want to hurt teachers or I don't want to hurt schools by opting out, you're not hurting by opting out. By participating in high stakes testing, that's what's hurting the schools. And the more that, we don't resist that, the more it's allowed to be perpetuated. And we're really, here we are in 2017, really kind of seeing the implications of not challenging that earlier and with greater numbers. So anybody else want to have anything, last comment that they just want to add in terms of this conversation around opting out in high stakes testing? Okay, well, I want to thank all of you brave parents and you, Zach, student, for being able to see the big picture on this, and then also acting within, the interests of your kids and within your own rights as parents, and really for the betterment of all public education. We applaud you. We hold you up as an example for other parents across the country. And parents, if you have any questions and you'd like to get more information, we have our email addresses listed on our website, Uniting for Kids, under About Us. And several of those featured here are members of Uniting for Kids. So we invite you to join us as well. And thank you again for tuning in. And to all of you, have a wonderful evening. Our next meeting is February 27th. Same format. The conversation will be on the issue of privacy, and we'll look forward to connecting with you then. Thanks so much and have a great night.
Night.